I pulled up to my family lake expecting peace, but instead what hit me was the sickening sight of dozens of dead fish floating belly up, their scales glinting under the morning sun like silver warnings of something sinister. And standing right there on the dock with her clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched like a crown, was Karen, the HOA president, arms folded and smirking as if she had orchestrated the whole scene. She didn't even wait for me to ask before she launched into her speech, saying the HOA had taken the liberty of treating the lake with chemicals to preserve the neighborhood's prestige and to stop what she called unsightly fishing. She didn't bother to hide the fact she was targeting me directly, telling me my family's dock, our small boats, and our weekend fishing trips ruined the aesthetic vision of her community. I just stared at her, calm on the outside though my blood boiled, and I said one thing that made her pause. You know this lake doesn't just feed fish, it feeds your water lines too. She waved me off, but she had no idea I was already planning how that truth was going to bury her. And before I even tell you how this went down, drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is, because trust me, you'll want to remember this story when it's your turn to deal with someone like her. The truth is I had come to this lake for peace. My grandfather built that dock with his own hands back when the property was nothing but raw land and a muddy stretch of water that locals didn't care for. Over decades, it became our family retreat, a place where we could fish, swim, or just sit by the water without worrying about the chaos of city life. When I inherited it, I promised myself I'd preserve it, not for money, not for status, but because it was the one thing still connecting me to my family's legacy. But peace has a funny way of attracting trouble, and in this neighborhood, trouble had a name, a clipboard, and a Lexus SUV. Karen had been circling for months before this day, dropping letters about how my dock didn't fit the uniform standard of the neighborhood, how my boat was parked too visibly, how my lake looked more like a public utility than a private jewel. Every complaint dripped with arrogance, like she believed she had been appointed the ruler of water itself. Still, I stayed calm. My instinct was never to fight first, but to wait, watch, and plan. When she sent bogus fines for improper shoreline maintenance, I ignored them and kept fishing. When she left pamphlets in my mailbox about future HOA redevelopment opportunities, I tossed them into the fire pit. And when she stopped me one afternoon at the gas station and said with a saccharine smile, "One day this will all be cleaned up for progress," I simply told her that progress doesn't come with trespassing on deeds that don't belong to you. That made her lips twitch, because people like her hate nothing more than a man who knows exactly where his boundaries lie. So when I found my lake poisoned that morning, I knew the slow drip of petty warfare had escalated into something dangerous. She didn't see a family dock. She saw an obstacle to her vision. And her vision was the kind that destroyed everything in its path if it didn't match the brochure she had in her head. As she stood there on my dock, she leaned in and said, "Don't bother calling anyone. The county won't side with a lone fisherman over an entire HOA. This lake deserves better than fishing lines and beer coolers." I told her calmly that she was right about one thing: the county wouldn't matter. But the law of water rights did. She rolled her eyes, thinking I was bluffing, as if generations of my family hadn't kept meticulous deeds and water rights documents tucked away in a safe. She saw me as just another stubborn man too sentimental to sell. But she was about to learn that sentiment and strategy can coexist very well when the stakes are your family's legacy. As the morning stretched on, I walked the shoreline, taking photos of the dead fish and the oily sheen that spread across the water. The smell was sharp, chemical, unnatural, and it broke my heart to see a place that once brimmed with life turned into a graveyard by arrogance. But heartbreak wasn't going to be the ending of this story. Heartbreak was going to be the setup. I watched a heron swoop down, circle, then veer away when it saw the poisoned water. Even the wildlife knew something was wrong. And yet Karen stood there talking to her board members, who had gathered in pastel polos and tennis skirts, clapping her on the back for a job well done. It was surreal, like watching a group of vandals congratulating each other for burning down a church. I decided not to argue in that moment because arguing was exactly what she wanted. She thrived on confrontation, on baiting people into losing their temper so she could play victim. Instead, I gave her silence, which unsettled her more than yelling ever could. I just told her, with a calmness that made her frown, "I'll let the water do the talking." She laughed at that, thinking it was just some country proverb. But I meant it literally, because the truth she didn't understand was that beneath this lake, running deep under the limestone and clay, was the aquifer that supplied her subdivision's drinking water. She had just poisoned her own community, and all I had to do was sit back, document, and let the pipes carry her arrogance straight to the faucets of every house she thought she ruled. That night, sitting on the porch overlooking the still water, I thought about how conflicts like this never start big. They start with one arrogant demand, one smug comment, one bogus fine. And if you don't stand your ground early, those small sparks turn into chemical slicks that destroy everything you care about. My family had always taught me that land is not just dirt, and water is not just something that fills a glass. They are dignity, responsibility, and legacy. Karen thought they were leverage. That difference was going to be her undoing. But the real lesson I had learned over years of dealing with people like her was simple. Never show your cards too early. Let them think they're winning. Let them parade on your dock with champagne flutes and golf clap. Let them poison the water they drink. Because when the truth finally surfaces, it doesn't just expose their arrogance, it drowns it. And as I sat there watching the moonlight ripple across the poisoned lake, I knew exactly how this story was going to end. Calmly, legally, publicly, and with Karen choking on the taste of her own victory turned bitter. The days after the poisoned lake were quieter on the surface but heavier underneath, like a storm that had passed but left the air charged with static. Karen had gotten exactly what she wanted for the moment, which was silence on the water. No fishing boats, no kids casting lines from the dock, no neighbors walking the shoreline with coolers in hand. She strutted around with her board members as if she had conquered something, patrolling the community with her Lexus SUV gleaming like a symbol of order. Yet the stillness of the lake was deceptive because beneath that glassy surface a different current was moving, one that would soon pull her under. The first real escalation came in the form of official-looking envelopes slipped into my mailbox. Inside were fines marked with HOA letterhead, claiming I owed thousands for improper shoreline use, for unapproved dock maintenance, for violating community standards with fishing equipment left visible from the road. I read them calmly and dropped them in a folder because I knew exactly where my deed began and ended, and it sure wasn't under their jurisdiction. When I saw her next at the store, she gave me that smug little smirk and said she hoped I was staying up to date on my obligations. I told her straight, the only obligations I honored were to the land itself, and that land didn't sign contracts with her HOA. Her face pinched like she had bitten into a lemon, but she kept smiling for show, because Karen's power came from looking confident even when she was cornered. Not long after, I caught sight of survey markers suddenly appearing around my property line, orange flags stuck in the soil like little stakes of invasion. A team of young men in safety vests had been hired by the HOA to mark what they claimed was community property, even though my deed went back nearly a century and never once mentioned their association. I walked out, calm and steady, and asked who authorized them. They pointed up the hill where Karen stood with her clipboard, sunglasses flashing in the sunlight. She waved like she was hosting a parade, calling out that the HOA was simply verifying its rightful easements. I told the survey crew they were trespassing and had 10 minutes to pull up every flag or I'd have the sheriff out. They looked uneasy, packed up, and left in their trucks while Karen shouted down that I was obstructing progress. I just waved back and told her progress without respect was vandalism in a polo shirt. Later that week the sheriff did show up, called by Karen herself, who claimed I was harassing contractors. He pulled into my driveway in his cruiser, leaned on the hood, and listened to my side while chewing gum slowly. The man knew my family history and knew I wasn't the type to harass anyone, but procedure forced him to check things out. I showed him the deed, showed him where the flags had been, and even he admitted it was flimsy at best. Still, he told me the best course was to work it out with the HOA because technically they had influence in the community. Influence, not ownership. He gave me that look like a man caught in the middle, knowing Karen was going to keep calling until she got her way. I told him I understood, shook his hand, and let him drive off, but deep down I also knew every neutral stance taken by authority only emboldened her. People like Karen feed on silence, on hesitation, on those gray areas where nobody wants to take a side. The gossip around town began to shift as the tension mounted. At the old store by the highway, the owner, a man named Henry who had been around longer than most of the houses here, leaned over the counter one morning and told me flat out, they're whispering about making the lake off-limits for good. He said Karen had been talking to anyone who would listen about the health risks of fishing, the dangers of boats, the visual clutter of docks. He shook his head and told me not to underestimate her, because gossip in small towns can build momentum faster than truth. Later that afternoon a local fisherman came by with his 2 kids, both holding empty rods, and told me they'd been yelled at by HOA volunteers for even standing near the shoreline. His kids looked up at me with confusion in their eyes, like they couldn't understand why a place that had always welcomed them suddenly felt forbidden. I told them they could always fish from my dock when things cleared up, because this lake wasn't going to be stolen without a fight. Karen's strategy was becoming clearer with each week. She wasn't just targeting me. She was slowly trying to poison the community's perception of the lake itself. She spun tales of liability, safety, property value, all the while cloaking her obsession in the language of order and prestige. At one point she even held a coffee gathering for residents where she displayed glossy pamphlets showing what the shoreline could look like without fishing docks or boats, replaced instead by luxury condos and manicured walkways. That was when an investor appeared on the scene, a slick man in a tailored suit who attended HOA meetings with Karen and nodded approvingly as she spoke about vision. I caught his eye once as I stood in the back of one of those meetings, and though he didn't speak to me directly, I could see he was weighing risks against profits. Investors don't care about lakes or legacies. They care about whether arrogance can be monetized. But not everyone was blind to what was happening. A neighbor I'd barely spoken to before stopped me one morning to say she thought Karen was pushing too far. She whispered that people were getting nervous about how fast she was moving, about the chemicals, about the fines, about the trespassing. She didn't want to cross Karen openly, but she wanted me to know that not everyone believed her story. That small gesture mattered because it told me Karen's control wasn't as absolute as she thought. And as every smug grin, every bogus fine, every trespass piled up, I began to see the cracks forming in her armor. She thought she was building consensus, but what she was really building was resentment that would break wide open once the truth of what she had done to the lake became impossible to ignore. I could feel the pressure building with each encounter, like water pressing against a dam that had been patched together with cheap concrete. Karen thought she had locked me in with rules, surveys, fines, and gossip, but what she didn't understand was that all she was doing was documenting her own arrogance for me. Every letter, every flag, every word at every meeting was evidence. Evidence that would become her undoing. For now, though, I stayed patient, letting her believe she was winning, because the worst thing you can do to a person drunk on control is let them drink deeper. When the glass finally shatters, the cut is always their own. The moment that marked the turning point didn't come with a letter or a clipboard, it came with the stench of chemicals so sharp it clung to the air and made my throat burn as I walked down toward the water one early morning. There was no mistaking what had happened because the surface of the lake shimmered with a greasy rainbow, and the smell was the same one I had caught faint traces of when they had treated lawns up the hill weeks earlier. Only this time it wasn't a patch of grass being sprayed, it was my entire lake. The fish that had survived the first round of poisoning now floated lifeless near the reeds, the frogs that used to croak in the evenings were silent, and the water that had always looked like glass reflecting the trees now looked like a mirror cracking from the inside. Standing near the shoreline, I could see tire marks where trucks had backed down in the night, heavy enough to leave ruts in the dirt, and empty barrels stacked neatly in the corner with the HOA logo stenciled on them. They hadn't even tried to hide it, because people like Karen never believe they have to. She had crossed from petty harassment into outright destruction, and though my chest tightened with fury, I steadied myself, because fury wasn't going to win this. Calmness was. Karen, of course, didn't see it as destruction. She saw it as victory. Later that same morning she held a little gathering on the HOA dock, the kind of smug champagne celebration that made your skin crawl. She had a dozen of her board members there, all in bright summer clothes, sipping and clinking glasses while she made a speech about how the lake had finally been treated for its long-standing problems. She spoke about clarity, aesthetics, and vision, sprinkling in words like progress and prestige, as if she were unveiling a monument instead of a graveyard. I stood a distance away, close enough to hear but far enough to let her bask in her moment of triumph. She locked eyes with me once, smirked, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "At least now this lake won't be cluttered with beer cans and fishing poles." They laughed, thinking the battle was over, and that's when I knew exactly what needed to happen next. Because what Karen and her army of clipboard warriors didn't know, and what I had known since the day I first inherited this land, was that the water beneath the surface carried more than fish. This lake fed into the aquifer that supplied the very subdivision she was so desperate to control. Every faucet, every shower, every glass filled from their kitchens drew its source from here. By poisoning my lake, she had poisoned her own people, and the beauty of it was I didn't have to lift a finger. All I needed to do was document and let the water speak for itself. Still, I knew evidence mattered more than anything when arrogance turned into legal warfare. So I began my hidden plan quietly, methodically, with the same patience my grandfather had used when he laid out the first stones of our dock. The first step was to record. I took photos of the barrels, the chemical sheen, the dead fish floating in clusters like tragic proof. I filmed short videos of the way the water frothed near the spill site where the contractors had dumped their load. I saved samples in glass jars, sealing them tight, labeling them with the date and time. Then I called the County Environmental Board and requested an independent inspection, framing it not as a neighbor dispute but as a concern for public health. Bureaucracy might move slow, but when it hears the word contamination, its ears perk up fast. I also reached out to a state-level water regulator, someone my uncle had known years back, and though the conversation was brief, it ended with a promise that an investigator would be sent soon. These steps weren't dramatic, they were deliberate, and that's the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge is loud and impulsive. Justice is quiet until it's undeniable. At the same time, I reinforced my own land, because I knew Karen would not stop. I sealed the irrigation gates that controlled flow from my side, making sure they could only be accessed with locks I installed myself. I set up discreet trail cameras hidden in the trees overlooking the shore, because if they dared to sneak down at night again, I wanted every truck, every face, every plate number captured in crystal clarity. I started keeping a log of every encounter, every conversation, every smirk and threat, because when the time came, I wanted a record so airtight that no lawyer or board member could wiggle free. I wasn't preparing for a fight on her terms, I was preparing for one on mine, and mine involved patience, paper, and proof. Meanwhile, the community began to fracture under the weight of what she had done. Henry at the store told me customers were whispering about the smell of their tap water, how it suddenly tasted metallic or chemical. A mother told me her kid had broken out in a rash after playing in the sprinklers. The fishermen's children stopped coming by, their father worried the water itself was unsafe. And through it all, Karen held her chin high, still talking about redevelopment and beautification, too arrogant to realize that every drop of arrogance she poured into the lake was dripping back into her neighbor's faucet. I watched her closely during those weeks, listened to her speeches, and noticed something interesting. Her confidence wasn't as steady as before. She had to press harder to convince people, her smile a little too wide, her words a little too rehearsed. She was beginning to feel the cracks, even if she didn't show it openly. An investor meeting sealed my resolve. I wasn't invited, but word traveled fast in small towns. Karen had pitched a grand redevelopment plan to turn the lakefront into a gated luxury resort with condos and private marinas, all funded by the same investor I had seen earlier. She painted me as the holdout, the stubborn relic clinging to outdated traditions. But as she was talking profits and prestige, residents were whispering about sick kids and foul-smelling water. The investor was seen leaving early, his polished smile dimmed, and I knew he had caught the scent of liability. Investors don't like uncertainty, and Karen was swimming in it now. That evening, standing on the porch as the sun sank behind the treeline, I thought about the long game. My grandfather had once told me that battles over land and water aren't won with fists, they're won with patience and proof. The arrogant burn themselves out if you let them, and all you have to do is make sure the truth is visible when it happens. I looked out at the poisoned water, at the reflection of the moon trembling on its sickly surface, and I whispered to myself that it was time. Time to stop playing defense and start laying the groundwork for the moment she would be exposed. Because sooner or later, that water she poisoned was going to run through every tap in her perfect little neighborhood, and when it did, no pamphlet or speech or smug smile was going to save her. So I waited, documented, and built my quiet wall of evidence, knowing the day would come when all I had to do was open the gates and let the truth pour out in front of everyone. Karen thought she had control, but she had handed me the rope to tie her downfall the moment she tainted the water. And that rope was getting tighter every day. The morning of the showdown was calm in a way that felt rehearsed, like the hush before an orchestra begins, but I knew the silence meant something far worse for Karen than it did for me. She had called a public, lakefront beautification celebration, handed out tiny scissors for a ribbon cutting and invited the whole subdivision to admire her so-called improvement, a perfect stage for the smug to preen and the curious to gather, and that was precisely why I showed up with a folder thick with evidence, a few printed lab reports, and a calm-eyed practiced until it felt normal. She stood on the HOA dock wearing her usual sunglasses and a smile that had been through too many rehearsals, waving at neighbors like a queen at a parade while volunteers in pastel polos passed around lemon water and tiny paper plates with cookies. She leaned into a microphone and said, "We solved the eyesore, we protected property values, and we ensured our children have a safer environment," and the crowd clapped like automatic shutters closing over judgment. I waited until her speech thinned and the ribbon lay taut in her manicured hands, then stepped forward, walked up the boardwalk with my steps measured and slow, and when she squinted at me I simply said, "Good morning," because nothing throws a smug person off faster than a polite voice in the wrong place. The murmurs started, phones rose, and someone from the back called out, "What's he doing here?" I answered, "I'm here to show everyone what your safety looks like," and that got a few uneasy chuckles from people who had never smelled what I had smelled beside their wells. I didn't shout, I never shout. I handed the folder to a county officer who had arrived quietly at my call the day before, a man with a neutral face and a clipboard full of warrants and the kind of patience that comes from reading reports on contamination long enough to understand when a case is solid. He flipped through the pages, glanced at the photos of the dead fish, the videos of the trucks, and the sealed water samples labeled and initialed. Then, with that plain procedural voice that carries the weight of authority, he announced he had a state environmental inspector on the line and that they were en route to perform immediate tests. Karen's smile faltered just a hair as she heard the words, as if someone had murmured a minor inconvenience during a wedding toast. She tried to laugh it off, saying, "This is ridiculous, a witch hunt against progress," and a couple of her diehards clapped to show solidarity, but the air had shifted. Clips of her earlier bragging about clearing the lake had been sent to a few neighbors the day before, and now those clips looped in people's heads like a bad jingle. When the state inspector arrived, she was all business in a plain coat, eyes that did not dance for charm, and a kit of field test instruments that felt more invasive than any microphone Karen had used. She drew water at several points, near my dock, by the inlet, and at the HOA irrigation intake, then left to run the tests with a promise to return quickly. The minutes stretched thin, but I watched the crowd instead of glancing at my phone, watching faces change from polite interest to growing concern as mothers crossed their arms, as kids who had been promised splash days looked confused, as old men who'd fished these banks for decades said the names of species they hadn't seen in years. Karen tried to regain control, stepping up to me and hissing, "You're causing a scene," and I said, calmly, "You caused the scene when you poured chemicals where you shouldn't have." Her comeback was a clipped, "We treated it for everyone's safety," and someone near the back yelled, "My tap water tastes weird," which landed like a pebble in a pond, sending ripples of questions outward. Then came the first twist I had been waiting for. The inspector returned, walked up the dock, and read aloud the preliminary findings. High levels of contaminants consistent with the compounds used in the barrels seen at the spill site, contaminants that exceeded safe drinking thresholds for prolonged exposure. She explained in plain terms that the HOA's treatment had likely introduced toxins into the aquifer feeding the subdivision. The words aquifer and drinking water had an audible effect. Several people paled, others started fumbling for their phones as if to record the moment before denial could smooth the edges. I could see Karen's face go from practiced porcelain to something like alarm. She tried to laugh, tried to call it a false positive, but the inspector had already placed temporary restrictions on the HOA's irrigation and advised residents not to use well water for drinking until confirmatory lab results arrive. That announcement was the second twist. While the first twist was the county fines beginning to crystallize, the second was institutional and irreversible, regulatory action that meant liability, legal exposure, and the withdrawal of investor interest in a heartbeat. People who had admired her vision began to whisper about lawyers, about class action suits, about the cost of bottled water for a community that hadn't planned for its leader to poison its tap. Public humiliation does not always need a shout. Sometimes it arrives in the slow, mechanical way of neighbors exchanging faces and phones, and the way applause turns into stunned silence. Karen's board members scattered, trying to form little rings of denial, but the footage from my hidden cameras, truck plates, the barrels with HOA logos, men unloading at night, rolled on phones like documentary evidence you couldn't edit out with a glossy brochure. A meme-ready line someone cut and saved went viral on the spot. "You just poisoned your own drinking water." I said it plainly into a neighbor's phone when she asked for a quote, and it ricocheted on social feeds with a punch that made people laugh in disbelief before they started to cry for the kid. The investor, who'd been seen earlier, left the area with his tie loosened and a man who looked to be his counsel in tow. Rumors had already started that he was pulling out, not because he had a moral awakening but because profit margins don't survive the smell of liability. Meanwhile, the sheriff, who had been careful to maintain distance, approached the inspector and accepted a complaint. The legal gears began to turn. In the fallout that followed, the HOA board found itself in a rapid collapse of authority. Residents demanded immediate meetings, some marched to demand refunds for dues, others called their own attorneys. Karen was called to explain herself at an emergency session, and she tried to speak, tried to reframe the narrative as a misguided attempt to help, but the cameras, the tests, the evidence were louder than her words. The county issued preliminary fines, environmental bonds were discussed, and social feeds filled with short clips titled things like, "HOA poisoned our lake." And who knew Karen would literally do this? The store owner I'd spoken with earlier came up to me, clapped my shoulder and said, "You did what I wouldn't have had the stomach for," and I replied, "I didn't want the stomach for revenge, I wanted the stomach for truth." The fisherman who'd once stood with his empty rods came back, hugged me in front of a group of people, and his kids ran to the shore with bait in hand because suddenly the place felt like something worth defending again. By the time the dust settled enough to count losses, Karen had been stripped of her role pending an ethics review, investors had withdrawn their interest, and multiple homeowners had filed suits alleging negligence and false representation. The county required immediate remediation, and a schedule for water testing was set that would be publicly visible to all the residents. The community that had once applauded her as a visionary now circulated petitions for accountability. I didn't gloat. Victory tasted like water that was finally safe to drink rather than like triumph. I stood at the dock days later as recovery crews worked and neighbors brought bottled water for each other, and I reflected out loud that land and water were never mere assets. They were obligations, trust, and a covenant between people and place. Then, because this whole mess had begun with an angered mind and a smug smile, I looked at my camera, toward everyone watching, and said, "Tell me in the comments, have you ever dealt with a Karen like this? Where are you watching from, and what time is it? And if you want more stories where patience beats pride, hit subscribe." The crowd laughed softly, one of those human laughs that holds relief and disbelief together, and phones kept buzzing with clips that would be shared until the neighborhood learned to value the water that fed them, because nothing humbles a person in power like the simple fact that everyone drinks what they do.